Welcome. Today we are recording from Alpbach, a little town in Austria, where every year for 2 weeks there is the European Forum Alpbach, which is a conference where young people meet to discuss the future of Europe. And we are today very happy to be joined by Ian Goldin, who is a former vice president of the World Bank, former advisor to President Nelson Mandela, and also the founding director of the Oxford Martin School. So thanks a lot, Ian, for being here.
It's a great pleasure.
Today we will discuss about Europe's role in reducing global poverty and also in helping poorer nations catch up with the more developed world. And we'd like to start with some figures. In the last 40 years, global reduction of poverty was to some degree quite successful. In fact, in the 1990s, it stood still around 40% of the global population. Today, at around 10%. But of course, it was not a very linear process. In fact, we see that this reduction was driven to a large degree by China and India, while sub-Saharan Africa, we still see today that there's around 35% of the population in extreme poverty. So how come in some parts of the globe we were so successful and in others not really?
Yeah, the first thing I think to stress is how successful the period since 1990 has been. I think that's largely due to what are positive aspects of globalization. There's many negative aspects, but positive aspects, not only in creating jobs and incomes, but also improving health, education, girls' literacy, many, many dimensions, from vaccines to gay rights, LGBT rights spreading around the world. And the progress has been the most rapid in human history. As you indicate, it's very uneven. It's been relatively successful in Latin America. It's been relatively successful in Eastern Europe, largely through the integration with Europe. It's been relatively successful in East Asia and South Asia. Improvements even in a place like Bangladesh, for example. And that's largely the result of much more rapid growth. China growing on average by about 10% over 40 years. You double your incomes every 10 years when you do that. And although some people have got more rich than others, everyone has got richer and the state has got richer, which means it's been able to invest in infrastructure, in education, in health, and other things. That's been partly domestic in many parts of the world, but also due to more trade. And the countries of Asia particularly, but also Latin America and Eastern Europe, have benefited enormously from for example, the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, which in 1994 halved the tariffs that the rich countries were imposing to prevent imports. So tariff have been very important. Capital flows, foreign direct investment, and that's partly the result of countries opening up much more. Much better macroeconomic management. The oil shocks of the 70s and 80s, hyperinflation, more stable economies, learning how to manage economies, and just knowledge generation. It's no accident that this period of the highest growth in history is the period after the invention of the World Wide Web in 1990. All of these things are very, very important contributors to the spread of knowledge, the spread of ideas, and the spread of technologies investment. Aid has also been very important. Aid flows increased. There was an ambition to have 0.7% of gross national income in aid. Some countries, mainly the Nordics, achieved that. But now there's a regression, a very significant regression. Aid is not a panacea. You cannot develop with aid, but it can help, and particularly by rewarding reformers, by focusing on areas that governments might have neglected, like girls' education, like clean water. And some countries have done spectacularly well. Maybe the best success stories of aid are, of course, South Korea and Taiwan. but also Eastern Europe has been a major beneficiary. If you give a thought experiment and compare, for example, Eastern Europe before the fall of the Berlin Wall and now, or compare South Korea and North Korea, what becomes very rapidly apparent is that ideas and business processes, technologies, are the most significant shaper. So what's transformed Eastern Europe is not just that there's investment and trade, is that ideas have changed. And the same is true if you compare South Korea and North Korea. North Korea is basically a bit like the world was in the 1950s, and has remained so. Whereas the rest of the world has moved on very significantly. And so all of these things account for it. The big part of the world that's been left out is Africa, although it's very dangerous to generalize because it's 52 countries and with some of the highest performers in the world, with some of the lowest performers in the world. And so there's some countries which have done spectacularly well in reducing poverty. Some have done well and now regressed. I would put South Africa in that category. The main issue, I think, facing Africa in the future is that the ingredients of growth in Asia no longer exist. Basically, what developed China, what developed Korea, what developed many countries, Taiwan, was manufacturing, mass production, lots of unskilled workers going out of the countryside into factories. And in some countries like the Philippines, into call centers. And in some places like in Bangalore, in India, going into back offices, administrative offices for big credit card companies, health companies, legal firms. These people were filling in forms and moving pieces of paper. None of this exists anymore. This is now all in the cloud. And manufacturing increasingly is robotic. Manufacturing is increasingly automated, and it's the price of capital, not labor, that matters. And you need skilled labor, not unskilled labor. And so the big question facing Africa is how will it manage in that world? That the middle rungs and lower rungs of the development ladder, which all countries historically, including Britain and European countries and the US, have developed with historically, those bottom rungs are now basically disintermediated, taken out by artificial intelligence and robotics and so on. So this poses a new and different challenge. The second thing that's very important to bear in mind is demography. Asia grew when its population was growing rapidly. Now it's relatively richer. Its population is no longer growing. China's population is actually contracting. Fertility rates, even in India now, are below replacement level. Africa is lagging behind. Fertility rates are coming down in Africa, but they're still way above. So there are 20 to 25 million more people coming into the workforce every year in Africa that need jobs. And the big question is where will the jobs come from? China has a different issue. There are 4 million less workers each year in China. So artificial intelligence doing jobs is a good thing in China. It's a bad thing in Africa. And this is a big, big challenge for Africa going forward. So it's not obvious where the development model is going to be.
Yeah, and considering the progresses of globalization and what you just mentioned, artificial intelligence, do you foresee a breakthrough of technology, of digital technology in the African continent, the possibility of Africa to becoming a leader or to leapfrog on technology?
I think, again, generalizations are dangerous about technologies. There's some technologies which have been incredibly helpful for Africa. Mobile phone technology, for example. It's enabled African countries to leapfrog, not to have fixed lines and go straight to mobile. And so mobile penetration and connectivity is very good, actually, in many countries. Even in very poor places, you will see mobile connectivity. And now new low-orbiting satellite technology, Starlink and others, is helping that. Because you don't have to have towers anymore everywhere. So these things are helpful. There's some really remarkable things happening in digital health, for example. Online education. But it doesn't create jobs. It's not employed. It can facilitate it, but it doesn't create it. Technologies on energy are also improving for Africa, particularly solar, wind, to not have to rely on big central power stations, to be able to develop microgrids, local grids. This is very important at low cost for creating small businesses, for refrigeration, for health, and so on. But I think those positives need to be seen also in the light of negatives, which is this job question. And also that a lot of the AI that's used is not generated in Africa. Far less than 1% of programmers in the world are African, in Africa. If you're a computer programmer doing well, you get recruited to California or somewhere else. And so there's bias, there's algorithmic bias, that the models that are being used are often models that are based on data, which is created elsewhere. So there's lots of issues. There's issues around jobs, there's issues around algorithmic bias, and there's some very troubling issues which around cybersecurity and cyber theft and fake. It's much more difficult, I think, even for a very sophisticated country in Europe or the US, there's cyber theft.
Yeah.
Steal people's bank accounts, steal people's information, steal people's identity. That's even more difficult when you have a weak institutional structure and you don't have the means at your country. So there's a real danger, I think, of mass theft, scams, and so on, because the policing, the security, etc., is weaker. So those are other concerns that I think undermine development in Africa and undermine democracy.
And technology can also have an important role in eradicating poverty as well, because, for example, it has been estimated by the Brookings Institute that we will need around 100 billion of dollar per year in order to eradicate poverty, in the sense to lift people in extreme poverty above the poverty line of the World Bank. And one way is to directly send money through indeed mobile phones, for example. Could you explain to the audience if this could be the most effective solution for Africa to end poverty?
Direct cash transfers can be helpful. People tend to know best for themselves what to do. There are some fears that they just spend it and then it's gone on alcohol or entertainment. But actually, the evidence suggests that people tend to spend it on investment, on their children's education, on health, on building a house, on buying some cows or chickens or whatever to create a business. So it can be helpful. It partly depends who you give it to. There's some evidence that giving it to women is better than giving it to men, that they spend more wisely. So it can be, but it's not a solution on its own, because if you also need to change the institutional framework. If there's no school to go to, you can't send your child to school. If there's no clean water, you can't overcome waterborne diseases, even if you get money. If there's no jobs, maybe create your own business, but it's very, very difficult. If there's no rule of law, if there's theft, if there's no roads, if there's no infrastructure. So it's part of a solution, but it's not a panacea. It's not a magic bullet. And there's no substitute, really, for governments doing things as well, capable governments. It doesn't have to be national government. It can be regional government. And India is very interesting in this respect because the regional governments are quite federal, decentralized, do things differently. But you can give people a lot of money. If it's very difficult to spend it wisely if you an island in a storm. And so helping governments become more effective is also very important.
And I would say that we achieved significant progresses in understanding that poverty indeed is multidimensional and is not just a matter of income, it's a matter of education, access to health facilities, social networks, and so on. And on the other hand, we significantly reduced the number of poor individuals across the globe. But recently, the Trump administration, which is arguably the most influential country in the world still, they prioritize poverty reduction and development policies from the US political agenda. So in your opinion, from a macro political view perspective, is poverty reduction becoming less appealing in the West, and what does this imply for the future of the poorest nations?
Well, I think the cuts in aid are very misguided. I think they're a tragedy for the people that are suffering from many millions of people will die, including from not, for example, having HIV retrovirals, poverty increasing, etc. And I think it's ethically indefensible. The rich countries have never been richer. And the poor countries have never, if the aid is well spent, we know more how to spend it wisely and how to make it effective. We've learned a lot. And the aid agencies have learned a lot. So giving money effectively has never been more effective. And so there's no rational or logical basis for saying aid is wasted, therefore we shouldn't give it. Yes, huge amounts of aid have been wasted. They're particularly wasted when you give them for political reasons. That's happened in the Cold War, when Russia and the US, or mainly, but Europe got involved, were fighting ideologically. So you give to your friends. Russia gives to communist countries, the US gives to its dictatorships and others. So there has been huge waste of aid. And when you look at the distribution of aid, it doesn't really match. It hasn't matched clearly enough effective use of aid. Israel, Egypt, these countries get the most aid. And it doesn't even seem to bring political leverage now. So I think it's right that people campaign for more effective use of aid. But I don't think that's the same as saying, therefore we need to cut aid. Because actually, where aid is given effectively, and there are thousands of good examples of this, it makes a fundamental difference. You go back to my examples of the first aid after the Second World War, which was countries. The World Bank was created to reconstruct Europe and Japan. Its name is the International IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The focus was Europe, and it's been an astounding success. The two countries that it focused on, Germany and Japan, which were the aggressors, of course, in the Second World War. So it was a feeling that to stop wars, you don't make the country, you don't blame them, you don't make them poorer, you give them money, you make them successful. It was the wisest thing that came out of the Bretton Woods conferences and Roosevelt and Churchill and others. And Keynes' big influence. It was what created the world we know today.
Yeah.
But that's an aid story. When I was at the World Bank, one of my jobs was to go and receive the final payment in Japan for one of the investments and high-speed rail, bullet train. And it's been an astounding success. So we know aid works. We wouldn't have Europe like we have it today without aid. And of course, Europe has continued to give aid. Yeah. We look at the success of Southern Europe. We look at the success of Greece now. We look at the success of Eastern Europe. These are aid stories, as well as many other things that go with it. The creation of the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, is also an aid story. We know aid works, but we need to be very careful in how we use it, very strategic, and not give it to criminals, not give it to corrupt people, not give it to people that are going to send it to Swiss bank accounts. And we know that when it happens. And not give it to people because they're going to support us politically, but give it because it's going to make a difference to poverty reduction. Yeah. And so I think it's very wrong that we're cutting aid. We should be increasing it. But I also think it's right that we keep asking tough questions about it.
And I think it's often said that the US is the main contributor to development finance. But actually, when looking at the EU as a whole, so EU plus member states, we are contributing more in development assistance. So I think around 42% of the global. So my question is now, seeing that the US is seemingly disengaging a little bit, where do you see the role of Europe, both strategically but also as a contributor to development finance going forward?
Yeah, I think collectively, Europe is now the biggest player, and hopefully will continue to be that. I think it's a very good player, but of course within Europe there's also cuts in aid, which I don't think is a good thing. I hope that the focus, which is necessary, on military expenditure to counter Russia does not lead to diversion from aid. Ukraine, of course, is going to need massive aid. Palestine, Gaza is going to need massive aid. So there are other big claims on aid, and these are going to have to be met. I think Europeans do feel generous, but there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of convincing them about the effectiveness of aid. And it's slightly paradoxical that the most effective aid is aid that's given to a government to do the right things, where they have ownership of it, where they believe in it. And the most effective aid is done in collaboration with other aid agencies, not going to a place and saying, this is my hospital, here's my flag, and your constituents back home think you're helping people, smiling faces. That's not the most effective aid. But it's the most politically easy one. And so there's a tension between aid being a team sport, where everyone has to, and the more the team works together, the more effective it is, and voters wanting to see it as an individual sport. And Europe has that tension, because aid in Europe is most effective when it gives it
as a
group, or through the EIB, European Investment Bank, which is tremendously effective. But voters don't see it. Voters want to see their minister at their project with their pet country that they like. And so that tension needs to be managed. I think it can be by, a lot of people having flags in the same place. But it also means that aid tends to go to concrete, not systems.
Yeah.
Because you can't put a flag on a judicial reform process that's been effective.
Totally.
Or improvements in education systems. You can't put it on a school or on something like that. And so that tension also needs to be managed. And it's a tension which relates to another big debate, which is measurement and how you actually measure the effectiveness of aid. Two Nobel Prize economists, Esther Duflo and Anijit Banerjee, have been pushing very much randomized control trials. That's part of a toolbox, but it's very dangerous if it's your only tool.
Yeah.
Because, again, you can't do that for judicial reform. You can't do that for a system change. You can only do that by isolating one place and only doing something in one place compared to somewhere else. And a place that has lots of data, which rules out the poorest countries. So these things are good, and I think it's a great thing, these randomized controls trials. But if they become the only tool you have a big problem in development.
And I think just for listeners, I think Good Economics and Hard Times is a big reading recommendation, so totally worth it to check it out. And what I wanted to come back on still is we read that of the overall development assistance, around 70% is still bilateral, right? And around 30% goes through multilateral development institutions. And I'm wondering, now that we are really shifting towards a world which is much more focused on geostrategic competition, will we see a decrease in finance going through these multilateral institutions? And will this lead to an increase of the phenomenon you have described before, that there are more strategic objectives guiding development assistance rather than real development objectives?
I think there is a risk that we go back towards a sort of more Cold War environment, not only tensions with Russia, but also with China as another big aid contributor. I think that's a real danger, that people give money for the wrong reasons, to support allies, really, rather than to support development. And part of that might be one is to influence the IBR, the World Bank and other institutions to become your institutions. This is what the Chinese have been quite effective with the New Development Bank and with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. So I think it is a danger. And these global institutions, EBRD, World Bank, are not perfect. So I think sometimes it's good to have both bilateral or European and competition between the banks. And for the clients, the countries it's also nice to have choice, to be able to choose and talk to them. For example, the World Bank will not finance dams anymore, effectively.
Okay.
So you want to build a dam, you don't start. I mean, they say they will, but it will take you a very long time. They won't fund nuclear power stations. There's certain things that they won't fund. They also don't do much regional projects, because you lend to a country. If you want regional infrastructure, you have a problem. So there's lots of things that require other agencies to come in, whatever you think about these things. So I think it's good that there's multiplicity, but I also think that they are more effective in the end. The World Bank has been severely undermined by many things, but including geopolitics. And it's good there's competition. On the other hand, it's still most probably the best institution in terms of development capability in the world. And undermining it further does not help development.
Yeah, and one of the key strengths of China in providing aid is, in relation to the EU and to the Western world, is to have less stringent conditions when providing aids on accountability, corruption, and transparency. And I would like to ask, in this world of geostrategic competition also in aids, if you could put yourself in the shoes of a leader of a third developing country, why could you choose a new aid in relation to a Chinese aid? What are the advantages?
Well, firstly, I think if you're a leader that really wants to develop your country, then you want the power of the World Bank or other institutions to help you reform the country. And instead of blaming yourself, you can blame the institution. This is quite helpful to externalize the control, not because you're giving it up, but because you understand you need to get, say, macroeconomic stability, that you need to reduce your debt. But you also recognize that politically, domestically, it's very difficult. If someone says, if you reduce your debt, we'll give you, $5 billion, that's helpful.
Yeah.
It increases your leverage to do the right thing. And so I think that we see that, for example, Milei in Argentina is using this very effectively at the moment. Turkey's done it in the past. China's done it. The World Bank is tiny in China. They've got much more money than the World Bank could ever give them. But they still have used the World Bank for pilot projects because it allows them to use the capabilities of the World Bank to learn from global experience and to, for example, on a Three Gorges Dam, which the World Bank helped finance, to develop best practice on environmental safeguards and things. After that, they won't use it again because it's a bit of a pain. But they know what the safeguards are and the environment, and they've learned a lot from it. So I think they provide that best practice. Sometimes it's also worst practice. When I was in South Africa, I often led negotiations with the World Bank, and we rejected the World Bank, and we went to other institutions like the African Development Bank, like the Islamic Bank, and others, and bilaterals, because we formed the judgment that the conditions the World Bank were posing were not appropriate for South Africa at the time. And we were lucky to be able to choose.
Of course.
At the same time, then I left South Africa. I went to the World Bank to help change it as head of policy. And that's why I went, because James Wolfenson, who was then the president, said, help me reform the bank. And the bank has improved. But it used to be a very bad policy prescription, one size fits all. So I think the institutions are also evolving, and China's also evolving. And countries are learning to negotiate more effectively as well. But it is very uneven, and it is true that the standards that China and some other bilaterals impose are much weaker. And sometimes I would say that's okay, and sometimes it's not.
In terms of long-term strategy. But talking about the data, you said indeed that there was an undermining of the World Bank also for geopolitical concept and also objectives. Can you give us an example, in your opinion, of long-term growth of a very successful intervention of the World Bank?
Yeah, well, I've given a few already, Germany and Japan. South Korea. These were countries all which graduated a long time ago. I think Eastern European countries have done pretty well. Poland's doing very well now. Received a lot of money from the World Bank. And working with European Bank for Reconstruction, EIB, and the European Investment Bank, and others. I think there's been successful examples across Asia. If you look at the levels of achievement in health outcomes in Bangladesh, for example, these are way ahead of what you'd expect given the income levels. I think the push of the World Bank for girls' education has been pretty effective and increased girls' education levels. There's setbacks now. COVID-19 really set things back in this respect. There are countries where, like Rwanda, like Kenya, which have accepted a massive amount of World Bank money. But I think the question now in these countries is about is that governance improved, but now is going backwards again. Kagame, the president of Rwanda, doesn't look like he wants to give up power. Uganda was also a success story, but Museveni now doesn't look like he wants to give up power. Kenya's becoming increasingly autocratic too. And I think the new Cold War environment, the geopolitical, is reducing this pressure for human rights, for democracy. The standards are slipping, and that's a great pity, because in my view of development, progress on human rights, reduction of corruption, is part of the development story. And I think it's difficult to have a society in which everyone can prosper when the elite are able to buy themselves out of problems, basically, and capture the state to some extent. So, yeah, I think there are many examples, Latin American examples too, but there's also question mark about whether these are sustainable.
One more question to compare a bit China and EU lending or Western lending. We often read in media that China is pursuing the so-called debt trap diplomacy. So basically lending money to a country to a certain degree, maybe also hoping that they cannot repay the loan, and then use this to have strategic leverage over the country. Question to you: do you agree with this assessment? And is Europe and is the West really not doing the same?
Yeah, this is something which the World Bank has often been accused of. Yeah. And some countries willingly want it, because to have a little bit of debt is the World Bank's is the country's problem. To have massive debt is the World Bank's problem. And countries that have massive debt include Turkey and Argentina and Pakistan now. If any of them defaulted totally, it would have a negative impact on the World Bank because of the scale of the debt which they've been allowed to accumulate. And so you basically give more debt in order to repay yourself, your previous debt.
Yeah.
This is true of the IMF. Refinancing,
Yeah.
IMF and World Bank. And so it's like this merry-go-round of money where you lend in order to repay yourself. But it keeps growing. And of course, interest rates matter because when interest rates go up, it goes up very quickly. So that is certainly something one could accuse, not so much the bilaterals, but the international, particularly the World Bank and the IMF, of. Is China deliberately doing this? I actually don't think so. I think China has been a very tough negotiator, and I wish sometimes it would be more. It needs to be part of the Paris Club and the other clubs of creditors in terms of renegotiation. Zambia has just been through this challenge, and the challenge is you lend to a bad government. They don't spend the debt wisely. And then you get a good government, as is the case in Zambia now, for example. They want to do the right thing, but they got this massive debt. They didn't take on the debt. The internationals, including China, say, no, you took on the debt, you have to repay it. We don't want what economists call moral hazard. We write off your debt, you just take on more debt in the future in the hope that it be written off.
It's precedent.
It's a precedent. And that's a real tension. My own view is that at times, and I think this is a time, where you need to be prepared to renegotiate as part of a development package. If you believe that there's a real fundamental change in the country, change in government that is serious, and they need to be given a chance. Otherwise, they cannot deliver. Does this cost the internationals money? Yes. But that's part of, I think, what they are there to do. They need to make the judgments. But obviously, if you do that repeatedly, then you're in a moral hazard
Yes.
problem. Then you are in the problem, which I think has happened in Pakistan, happening in Turkey, where the guy, Turkey's now turned the corner. Okay, the president no longer can control interest rates. So, but these are judgments that So I'm sympathetic to the need not to always write off debt. On the other hand, particularly for the lowest income countries, we need a big debt renegotiation now. We need another what was called HIPC in the highly indebted poor country initiative last century. We need another process like that in which people take a haircut. It's also the case that a lot of the debt is not public sector, is not international agency or bilateral. It's private.
Yeah.
The private banks also love this game.
Of course.
They like issuing debt, and they then play chicken about who's going to default, and so private sector also needs to be taught that if you lend to people that are not sustainable, you also need to take what we call a haircut.
Yeah. But do you see that there is from the Chinese side less willingness to renegotiate than from Western side, or can it not be that straightforward?
There has been some less willingness, but although now China is coming to the table, China is negotiating. There have been some incidences. I think people cite Sri Lanka as an example, where China has demanded assets in exchange, like a port, for example. But these are relatively isolated incidents, and I don't think they are a pattern. I think it was part of the renegotiation strategy there. The Belt and Road Initiative, the extent of Chinese aid, particularly in regional integration, I think is real. And if you ask the recipients, ask the African countries or ask the Asian countries that have been recipients, they don't have these same, everyone has some reservations, but they still want more money from China. They don't want less. And so I think sort of saying, somehow we have a moral high ground is firstly factually not correct, and secondly is not the way that the recipients think about it.
Yeah. And I would say also the absence of colonialist past is an asset for China.
Absolutely. China, can say, we were poor like you. We are your brothers. In solidarity, we're not part of the old imperial power. In fact, we were colonized too. And so we understand you. They don't have that baggage. So that's important. And I think there's also, they've done phenomenally well. Everyone would like to grow at 10%, and double the incomes every 10 years. And if you're a poor country, you have to look at the success of Chinese poverty reduction.
Talking about best practices,
and say, how did they do it, and what can we learn from them? So there's an attraction in working with China in that respect. And China's also been doing aid for a long time. If you're in Africa, everyone knows, for example, about the Tanzam Railroad from Dar es Salaam to Lusaka. This was 1960s and 70s, I think. And if you go along it, as I have, you see some people who clearly were the result of mixed marriages which came out of that, because China didn't just send money, it sent lots of workers and engineers and technicians, and most of them went home, but not all of them.
Someone decided to stay. But and so how do you see the future of development aid in terms of influence in Africa? Do you think is China going to have an edge?
Yes. I think China, mainly because China will continue to grow. As it gets richer, it will continue to grow. And the US is withdrawing. both in terms of its aid, but also soft power.
Yeah.
The reputation of the U.S. has been dramatically undermined. You don't please countries by putting a 50% tariff on them.
Yeah.
Or a 30%
Yeah,
tariff.
so it's complicated, the strategy.
AGOA, which was the garment industry of tariff-free access. These countries have developed whole industries which will now be destroyed.
Yeah.
So I think that, and people can't travel to the U.S. anymore and things. They don't get visas. So the U.S. has, in the last year or so, since the election of President Trump, undermined its soft power more quickly than it took 40, 50 years to build.
Yeah. And, and can the EU fill the gap of the US soft power, or do you think it's going to be replaced by China?
I think the EU should try to. I think it's an opportunity for the EU, but it's a big gap to fill at a time when Europe is feeling a very big budget constraint and having to invest more in defense. So whether EU has the financial capability, whether it has the political bandwidth, whether it has the public support, is an open question in my mind. I hope it does. It's also the case, I think, that a lot of, increasingly the focus of development is Africa. Asia's really developing. Latin America is really developing. And so, I'm generalizing, there are still very difficult places. But Africa's, and Europe has a lot of colonial bad history with Africa, but it also has a lot of recent experience. The German, the Dutch, the French aid agencies have done a lot of amazing things in many countries. Of course, there's also political pushback. We see France being kicked out of the Sahel.
Yeah.
And this is, and so in those countries, Russian influence and to some extent Chinese will grow. So this is worrying that there's like it's becoming more political. And I think it is a concern. But what Europe needs to show is places where it's involved, it works. Effective aid.
But I think this is also exactly the concern, at least in the public narrative, that we are a bit afraid, or at least politicians, I think, are afraid that if China, as you said, will probably take on a larger role in the development of Africa, there's also be political influence, so that maybe the African continent is more moving towards an autocratic political system, and which may be to the detriment of the democratic world we have in Europe. Do you share this concern, or is it overstated?
No, I think there is a risk that firstly, the U.S. Is no longer the forceful democracy it was globally. So Europe is more alone in this respect. Within Europe, there are even tensions around the issue. Europe is democratic, but many of the countries don't want to give more aid. So I think there's a big tension around that. And, Europe has to respect the democratic wishes of European citizens in this respect. So it has to win the public argument on it. I think we need to learn the lessons of how we've given aid to some countries, and we continue to, that are moving towards autocracy. I mentioned Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania. These were massive recipients of aid. On the other hand, some countries like Ghana remain, and Senegal has recently shown this, remain very resolutely democratic. What do we learn from this? How do we support democracy? And within autocracies, how do we try and ensure, it's a spectrum. They're still democracies, except the the leading party wins 97% of the vote
Yeah.
and arrests the opposition.
That's a bit, yes. Blurred.
How do we support others, and but do it in a way that doesn't reinforce, in a sense, the autocracy? Because part of the narrative is, here's the colonial power trying to dominate us again.
Of course.
And that, that's not very helpful for the opposition in the country. So how do you do that? And I think often the way to do it is to actually just believe in development. Believe that the more you educate people, the more you educate them, the more you educate girls, the better your gender outcomes, the better your political outcomes, etc. It's not true everywhere, and clearly China's developed without democracy. But I think if people have a democratic past, then I think it does reinforce it.
Maybe I would like to touch upon, because we discussed a lot about aid, and but we didn't really touch upon yet the private finance, right? And it's often said that actually private capital can also go a long way in supporting development objectives.
Yeah.
But we see that of all the private finance to developing countries, around a third goes actually to China, and I think the poorest 26 countries get only 2%. So if this is so important, how can these poorer countries attract more also private capital?
Well, international agencies like CDC, or what used to be CDC, British International Investment, IFC, EBRD, Propaco, FMO, DEG, they're all about this. How do you invest in the tough places? That's really what they have in common. And I think the answer is, firstly, it's very difficult to have private investment if you don't have the basics of infrastructure. I mean, you need electricity. You need rule of law to protect your private property. You need to reduce corruption. You don't want to have money that's just stolen from you, or that every time you do something you have to pay a big bribe. So the ease of doing business is an important part of the process. I think we need to recognize that big foreign investment is important, but it's mainly important as a show of confidence in the country. In the end, what drives economic growth, employment, is small businesses. And how do you make small businesses prosper? It's partly about the availability of capital, but it's also about the availability of electricity, of water, of security, of everything else that goes, and lifting the incomes of the country. So the reason why there's so little investment in very poor countries is because there's not much market. And many of these countries are too small economically to be interesting for global, but even domestic players to scale. There's only two countries in Africa, I think Nigeria and South Africa, which are the size of Belgium. Many of the African countries have GDPs which are smaller than a European city. So they're very small economies, and the transaction costs are pretty high. So ease of business and integration, so that you can scale the market, I think will be the two things that will improve private investment.
And I think we go for the last question because you have to leave. Our podcast is called Moving Europe. So we're interested in what people can do to move Europe in the right direction. And so we're interested from your side, if you had just one, even though silver bullets don't exist, but if you had one measure to propose, what would you say to move Europe forward?
On aid
And development.
I think what I would do is to try and encourage more aid and more effective aid. Focus the resources behind those places, people, institutions, investments, where you're getting growth, where you're getting development. And through that, by publicizing it, have a demonstration effect. Have a demonstration effect within the countries, that you can do it if you do the right thing, that you can have private investment, that you can scale it, that you can do it, but you have to change in order to do that. And a demonstration effect within Europe that aid works if it's effectively given. And I think both of those can create a virtual circle in which aid is more effective, and by being more effective, more is given.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Jan, for this amazing episode, and have a good day, and see you at the next Moving Europe.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you very much. Thank you for
Bye-bye.
having me.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Bye.